There we go. Good morning and welcome to Nonprofits Lead Protecting Yourself in today's cyber landscape workshop. This is the final workshop in our fall 2020 series. Here we made it to December of 2020. I think there were times during the year we thought that we might not. So congratulations to everybody and thank you for being here to join us. I want to welcome you all. Rather than take up time during the workshop, let's go ahead. I think people that said that they were willing to share, so we can do that. So I'd like to introduce Dawn Bowian of Huntington Bank. Welcome, Dawn. We have a partnership here at Nonprofits Lead with Huntington Bank as a ongoing collaboration. They've provided us with everything from speakers like they are today to space and time and some good conversations and some financial advice even and outreach to our nonprofits. And so we really appreciate Huntington Bank and we appreciate them in their continued partnership. We see that that's going to go on for a long time. Don himself is right here in Ohio. For those of you who are on my side of the river, I think the rest of you are in West Virginia, if I am seeing correctly. And he is a veteran. You know, I don't want to make anybody sound old, but he has many years of experience, including 30 years with the National Security Administration. And so both private and public sector work and continues to stay very up to date on what is going on in this field through his professional associations and the work that he does to the outreach work to prevent fraud. And especially he shared with me organizations like the nonprofits are near and dear to his heart so that he can protect our charitable funds that we have good purposes for. So everybody welcome Dawn. And also, if you have questions during the program, I'm going to be monitoring the chat. And so you can throw your question down there in the chat. And as it's appropriate, I will bring it up to Dawn. Also, if you are so moved and you'd like to unmute yourself and wave your hand, I'll call on you if we're able to do that. All right. So Dawn, I'm gonna go ahead and turn that over to you.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning to everyone. Really today we're going to talk about several things related to cybersecurity and how you can protect yourself and your nonprofit organization. Going to cover a few things here. Up front, we're going to talk about the threat landscape. So we're going to talk about some of those things that might be coming your way. Clearly, we're going to talk about pandemic-related cybersecurity vulnerabilities and risks. I do want to highlight, one big area where I know nonprofits are being hit in business email compromise, and we'll talk about exactly what that is, the vulnerabilities and risks of that. And then we'll kind of pivot and stop talking about the threats and the vulnerabilities and talk about best practices. I'll kind of go down through, and please, by all means, ask questions throughout the presentation, but we will have a question and answer session there at the very end too as well. So I don't think we have any lawyers on the call, but this is the by lawyers for lawyers slide. I won't even cover it. You guys have seen those types of things. I do want to jump in and dig in a little bit deep into the phishing. I think I don't even bother to define phishing these days because I think we all get those emails, right, into our inboxes that are kind of bogus. They're asking us to do something. But the interesting thing that I dug into a little bit is I started looking into the research around the psychology of it. A bunch of us, when we look at these emails, we say, well, no one would fall victim to that, right? It's just silly, right? It's the Nigerian oil prince or all the rest of those types of scams. No one would fall for that. The reality is people do fall for it. And I started digging into why is that? And there's some great research out there that talks about how we make decisions. And we kind of, psychologists say we make decisions in kind of one of two systems. That first system one thinking is very fast and unconscious, right? We make a quick decision, we move on. Most of the decisions, 90% of the decisions we make are in that mode. We don't spend a whole lot of time gathering background or information on it. It's rather automatic. But that system two thinking, the other side of that, really, we only make decisions in that mode about 10% of the time. It's a very slow, very methodical. We gather information. It's very logical. Some people would say it's kind of lazy because you're taking a long time to make a decision or you're indecisive. But the reality is you're gathering a lot of information. You're trying to decide what the best thing to do is. And you can imagine system one thinking, you're going to kind of fall victim to things a little bit more. System two thinking, you're going to think through it quite a bit. You're going to be a little more skeptical. So it's really that emotional versus logical, right? That emotional response, really quick. But really the question became, and it's specifically around this current pandemic time, right? And I know, if you guys can think back to March or April or May, and I won't say we're not concerned about it now, but I will say the fear and anxiety we had in, March, April, May timeframe was incredibly high, right? This was something totally new, a lot of fear, very high anxiety levels, and quite frankly, a lot of distraction, right? We're all worried about our personal safety, worried about the personal safety of the ones we love, worried about our organizations, right? Our nonprofits, how are we going to continue to provide services to folks throughout this type of thing. And, if you're like me, I'm a little bit of an information junkie. I love taking in information and data. I probably spend maybe more than 10% of my time making decisions in system two. But even that has problems, right? You spend so much time gathering all this information and processing it, making a decision. So all of that psychology to really say, if we're spending 90% of our time, and the example I usually use, right? You probably have it just like me, right? You've got an inbox and it's amazing how much email you get, right? And it all flows in. Some of it's garbage and some of it's valid, right? Some of it's actually, taking care of your nonprofit and doing all those business things you need to do. Well, weeding all those things out sometimes. If you're using system one, you'll occasionally click on things you shouldn't or respond to things you shouldn't, rather than taking that extra bit of time. So during this pandemic, really know that, that fear and that a higher anxiety level, and it still continues, although I would say some of us are starting, I won't call this a new normal, and boy, I hope this isn't normal, but I think we're starting slowly to get used to it, but there's still some of that fear and anxiety there. That's the reason why we fall victim to it. So let's take a look at phishing attacks. And this is just a small time period. If you take a look at it, right, February, late February, early March was really when most of us started kind of paying attention to this whole coronavirus thing. And wouldn't you know it, if you take a look at the spear phishing attacks in 2020 and you notice the later March and into early April, it just skyrocketed, right? So I'll tell you, it proves one thing. These bad guys have no conscience whatsoever. They're willing to prey on anybody at any time to get what they want, which is obviously typically, some way of getting sensitive information or getting funds. So let's break down some of these phishing attacks that you see that are coronavirus related. More than half of them are scams. And we're going to talk about some of those scams. Some of them are brand impersonation. And I say that, and I know the corporate side of things, people worry a lot about brand, right? As a nonprofit, you should worry about your brand too. It's really your reputation and what you do there. It's all that reputational risk. There's still a fair amount of blackmail too involved in that. And I'll highlight the 1% here, business email compromise. And although it's 1% and you can think, well, okay, I won't pay that much attention to it, the impact of that specifically on nonprofits, state and local governments, and small businesses is tremendous. And I don't cover it a lot in this presentation, but in one of the other ones, I talk a lot about, breaches and what happens If you're a large corporation, if you're a Target, if you're a Home Depot, all of these big corporations, when they suffer a breach, they're large enough that they can kind of suffer it and go on, right? Their stock takes a dip for a little bit and they're back up. They're back up and running. It's really kind of a blip on their screen. For nonprofits, state and local governments, or small businesses, it's existential. So that business email compromise you see there, if you're talking about, and we're going to talk about some large sum compromises in the BEC side of things, it can be really, you could have to shut your doors. Financially, it could really drain an organization to the point where they can no longer work. So I wanted to make this real for folks, not just show you graphs and things like that. I wanted to actually show you what some of these emails, these phishing pandemic-related emails look like. So let's take a look at a couple of them. They love to prey on folks and make it sound like it's coming from an official organization, right? The Center for Disease Control, right? We all kind of generally know that, CDC. They don't even have to spell it out for us, right? We know that's an official government organization. But wait a minute, and I've circled these, put a square around them in red to show you, wait a minute, you should really notice with the Center for Disease Control, right? Doesn't come from a domain called gravit.net. That's not typical. And I also wanted to highlight the link that you see there, right? Because if you read down through this one, especially during, remember, that March, April timeframe, you'd be clicking on that link quick, right? Because you want to know new cases in and around your area. We were all trying to figure out how this was spreading and how fast. You may still be in that mode, right? I know I keep track of it. But I want to make you aware that when you see that link, what appears to be a URL, Uniform Resource Locator, you see that link that there in that email, that's really just the text that the author of that email wants you to see, right? They make it look like a valid link, and they even make it say cdc.gov, right, which sounds a lot more official than gravit.net. But you need to be careful that the link that it actually goes to is not necessarily what you see on your screen. That's why I oftentimes say to folks, if you're on a desktop system, take your mouse and put your mouse over that link. Don't click on it. Put your mouse over the link, and typically a pop-up dialog box will come up and it'll show you the actual link that it's going to take you to if you click on it. So be careful with those. Take a look at that. If it looks odd, if it doesn't agree with the string that you see there, if you think it's going to take you to cdc.gov and it doesn't, that's a problem, right? So you need to be careful with things like that. Let's take a look at a couple others here. Here you see another one, very similar, right? If you take a look, and I always tell people, look at the from address. And sometimes even on your mobile phone, right, you can actually click on the from. It's not going to take you anywhere, so you're safe there. But click on the from address, and it'll show you the full email address, right? Not just the abbreviated, name or things like that. And you notice this one, cdchealth.org. Well, that sounds a little more official, but it's still not the official CDC website. So you need to be careful. And here, remember I said it's just the text for the link. If you actually take a look at that second red box that I have down there, it says CDC newsroom releases. Again, that's just the text that they choose to put up there that you'll see in the email. Behind it is actually the link, right? Here's one that I love talking to folks about, because usually the reaction I get on a lot of phishing emails is, well, I would never click that, right? And this one's one that comes in, and I love it. We always tell folks, look for misspellings and English language issues and all sorts of other things. You have being compensated. It's tough for me to even say. You have being compensated $2.88 million by the World Health Organization, right? With the impact of COVID-19, blah, 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 right? You're required to contact mitch.collins@hotmail.com. And you're like, wait a minute. Why is the World Health Organization going to use a email address at hotmail.com, right? That should be a first sign. Second one is the fact that, to receive your check payment, you need to give all this personal information and a shipment fee. By the way, you got to write them a check of $220. So there's a lot of things that you look at. But here's the reality. That email is out there and it continues to float because it works. Somebody is going to fall for it, unfortunately. Maybe not a large percentage, but quite frankly, for the bad guys, sending out an email is cheap. The costs of that are negligible. If they get one or two people to actually give them a check for $220, they're that much more richer, right? And they'll continue to do it as long as somebody will give them money. You remember I said be careful of those links, and here's a perfect example of that. Here they spend even a little bit more time, right? It comes from a domain called cdc-gov.org. Well, that again is not the official CDC website, right, or the official CDC domain, but it sure looks more official, right? And you notice the link down there. Now the link says www.cdc.gov, but remember, that's the text that they want you to see. What the link is behind that. And if you actually clicked, and this one I gave you a good example, here's where you'll be taken, right? You get, by the way, a pop-up dialog box that looks for your Outlook credentials. A lot of people these days using O365 or Outlook or Hotmail or a bunch of those other providers actually go to a very similar logon page here. So if you're busy, remember, if you're operating in type 1 decision making, you probably didn't think, hey, I was supposed to go to a CDC website and now I'm at an Outlook login screen. If you're like me and you're multitasking, you're going to say, oh, Outlook needs my credentials again, and you're going to enter your valid credentials in there. That's bad, right? So then your credentials are compromised. So you need to be very vigilant on these. And one of the first things I say to help with that system 1 versus system 2 thinking is take a pause, take a break before you just go clicking on things or even deleting things. Think of it real quickly and say, all right, wait a minute, is this real? Is it too good to be true? Let's
Don,
take
we
a
have
look.
a question about this.
Okay.
Would the CDC email be an example of brand impersonation?
Absolutely. And in fact, I think I have later on, but if not, I will tell you right now. I have an example where they start including nice graphics, right? I think the example I have is World Health Organization. They include the graphic of the World Health Organization. So it starts looking even more, right? It starts looking even more realistic. I will tell you, this isn't just about government organizations. Companies like Huntington, like other banks, like other places, get a lot of this brand impersonation. So yes, you're absolutely right. It is part of that brand impersonation. I know big companies typically have even firms that we hire, right, to look at brand impersonation and infringement from that side. And you have lawyers that go after them and all the rest of that kind of stuff. As a nonprofit, that's probably not a service you're going to pay for. Don't blame me there, but you do need to at least be aware from your perspective, look out for that brand. And if you see people impersonating your brand, there are things you can do, low-cost things you can do to register complaints with registrars or things like that to say, hey, take that down. And they typically will. It'll take a little bit of time, but they typically do. So in this example, if you click the link, if you'd entered your credentials, they're off now using your credentials and potentially your email account for bad things. So a lot of what I talked about here related to that domain, right? And in fact, the example you see is the cdc-gov.org, right? That's the domain. Let's take a look at during the time of the coronavirus when it was just ramping up, right? So here's the graph from January to about May, and you can see in March timeframe where fear was higher, the number of domains registered, right, with the word COVID or coronavirus in their name, right? Here's the number, and it was upwards of 5,000 per day, right, that were being registered. And I can tell you the difference on the graph here. The blue ones are what appear to be valid domains registered. Your local health authority will register a coronavirus or a COVID domain so that they can get out information. And the red line is the bad guys, right, the high risk score domains that were registered. We're talking about a lot of domains that were registered during that time period that are used for scams and things like that. So how do you know you're going to the right domain? That's an interesting and challenging problem. Let me give you a few things you can do to make sure to protect not just yourself, but your nonprofit too as well. Let's take a look at domain, and I'm going to use Huntington as an example here, right? We have a website called Business Online. It's where all of our corporate businesses go to bank with Huntington. There's a retail online site too as well. If you're a Huntington customer, you go to that one. You always want to use a bookmark to those sites, right? In your web browser, you want to bookmark the website. don't type in Huntington Banking in Google and try and find the website, right? For a couple of reasons. First and foremost, those first few answers you get back from a Google search are ads, right? Somebody paid to make sure that their business or their, advertisement showed up at the very top of that Google search, right? So they can increase traffic to their site. Bad guys are not above this. They will pay for the advertisement space. In this case, if they paid for one that said, business online at Huntington, so every time somebody Google searched for that, they'd go to that website instead of Huntington's. And then they're obviously going to ask you, it's going to look just like Huntington, right? It's going to ask you for your username and password. So you're going to want to use a bookmark, right? Go to that known website. You visited it before. You're going to bookmark it. And from then on, you're going to use that bookmark to take you there. As a nonprofit, when you're using Huntington or using somebody else's bank to do that, you want to bookmark your banking's website, right? Don't Google it every time. Don't try and type it in the web address yourself, right? Because you will potentially make misspelling errors, and they register domains that are common misspellings of that business you're trying to go to. So a couple things you can look for. You can look for the padlock. I know we've all been trained to do this. I think for the last few years, people said, well, it needs to be a secure website, so it needs to have the padlock. That is still a very good approach to look for, but I will tell you the bad guys got smart too. They are starting to encrypt their website, their bad guy websites too as well. So it'll come up with a padlock too as well, but still look for the padlock. And what you can actually do, I show you two web browsers here on this slide. The first one I think is Internet Explorer. Hopefully not many people are using that anymore. There are other web browsers out there. The bottom one's Firefox. And you notice in addition to the web address you see on your browser, it also shows you that window there that says, hey, this is registered and it's secure to Huntington Bancshares Incorporated, right? So if you clicked on it, and I'll use the Firefox example in the bottom there, you can check the security certificate, right? So if you clicked on that padlock, if you clicked on that area where it said Huntington Bancshares Incorporated, it will show you this pop-up dialog box. It says, yes, it is secure. It's a secure connection, right? And here's it's registered and owned by Huntington Bancshares Incorporated, Columbus, Ohio. And it's verified by a digital certificate company. This one is DigiCert, right? Incorporated. If you actually clicked, if you wanted to dig a little bit deeper, if you actually clicked on the more information that you see at the very bottom there, it'll be slightly different for other browsers, but you can find the same basic information. You'll get this type of a pop-up dialog box. Has some of the similar information, shows you when the actual website expires. Obviously, I took this one well before July. I had this slide in there for a while. Here's the area I want to draw your attention to, but have I visited this website prior to today? And if that website was a large number, right, you'd say, okay, that's the valid site, right? I've visited it many times before. If it's only 6 times or 2 times or 0 times, you'd say, hey, wait a minute. I do my banking all the time with them. It should say a number much higher. If you've cleared your history, that might be a good reason why that number is low. You can get the same type of information on how many times you visited that website through your history and other menu items in your browser. But just look for it. That's kind of a red flag that says, hey, wait a minute, only 6 times? And I can tell you I was visiting it 6 times to do these screenshots, in essence. So make sure you're visiting the correct website. Don't click on the ones that are ads. They could be spoofed websites. And be careful you're visiting the correct website before you enter any personal information or attempt to enter credentials. All right.
Don,
Okay,
we have
let's
another
take a look
question
at
for
who's
you.
Sure.
I have blocked emails like this and more keep popping up. It seems never ending. Is there a way to permanently block phishers?
Yeah, I wish there was a way to permanently do it. Unfortunately, the bad guys, the people who are doing the phishing emails, continue to change their tactics, right? So when you block one from one domain, they'll register a new domain and start sending you phishing emails from other domains. I do recommend, if you're using a webmail provider, if you're using Outlook, if you're using O365, if you're using a reputable email system, they're typically, usually you can report it as a phishing email. I recommend that you report it as phishing. What that will do for you is a couple things. You're not going to have any immediate effect for you. Typically it moves it out of your inbox. That's the only immediate effect it has for you. But over time, these webmail providers are trying to put it in algorithms that would get rid of those. In fact, if you look, you probably have a junk mail folder, right, where it's got a ton of those in there. So you're just seeing the ones that make it through all of their filters. It will refine their filter a little bit better. So over time, it'll catch a little bit more. But I'll tell you, the bad guys are after it like crazy. Since it's kind of an occupation for me, I actually collect all of those phishing emails, and I have a few friends who are like, "Ooh, I saw one with this. I'll send it to you." Netflix, Amazon. Oh my goodness! I can tell you the holidays are coming up, so UPS scams, lots of shipping types of scams, especially now, right? So as we're all doing, large percentage of us doing our Christmas shopping online. So be careful with those. Yeah, do report it. That will reduce it probably over time a little bit more. So let's take a look at kind of who's being targeted specifically. And I give you some examples. They might not be exactly from a nonprofit perspective, but what I will tell you is some of the same things that are targeting local governments, first responders, and healthcare organizations are also being used on nonprofits. All right. Here's one, and this is just truly sad. During the height of the pandemic, right? This was just as things were really bad in Europe. There was actually hackers targeting a hospital in the Czech Republic, and they actually had to turn away folks, unfortunately, from the hospital from care. I will tell you, since I made this slide, unfortunately, there was an instance in Europe very similar. A hospital was targeted. Their entire IT system was really crippled and forced to shut down. They were required to send emergency patients elsewhere, and the first death attributed really to the fact that the malware had been sent, ransomware had been sent to the hospital, unfortunately happened because the patient died en route to another hospital. So that's incredibly unfortunate, has life consequences. There are also other organizations that have been impacted. Here's an example, Champaign-Urbana. Remember I said state and local governments or health districts would register coronavirus websites. Here was one that was put up. We're all looking, like I continue to keep track of Ohio, am I allowed to travel for holidays? Thinking I'm not going to now. But, do I need to quarantine? What are the regulations now? Are businesses open? All of those questions typically are located on somebody's valid website. Here was one, a valid website that the bad guys kind of took down and denied access for citizens to actually get access to it. Another quick example I'll give you, Italy, very similar to the United States, decided to give stimulus types of checks to their citizens. And basically they did it a little differently. In Italy, you had to go on to the government's website, you had to register for the stimulus check, and then a check would be cut and sent to you. Unfortunately, that made an easy target for the hackers, who then kind of held it hostage, took down that website. And you can imagine, if for an entire country, if things were working perfectly and the hackers didn't do anything, that website would be busy, right? Every citizen in Italy trying to get to it to enter their information to get their stimulus check. The bad guys took advantage of it. They flooded that website with more and more traffic, took it down. That denied, I think, the Italian citizens, I think it was about $655 US crisis payment, really overwhelmed that site. This is a really big problem these days. The FBI has actually put out several reports. Cyber criminals taking advantage of COVID-19 for cyber criminal schemes, they are still happening. I would say they're tailing off a little bit, but not a lot. So please still stay vigilant from that side. I'm not going to talk about it a lot in this presentation. Next week, Huntington is running 3 webinars, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, that I'm giving, that are specifically on ransomware, because ransomware is also increasing tremendously. And I'll give you an example here with website. In fact, the website's from Johns Hopkins University. I love the website. I visit it. It has all sorts of statistics worldwide around coronavirus, the growth. You can keep track of it. You can drill down to nations and states, and it's great. It's driven by live data. Well, the bad guys saw this and they said, this is great. We'll set up a fake website that looks exactly like the Johns Hopkins site. In fact, they went the full 9 yards. The back end of that fake site was loaded with valid data. It pointed to the data sources that Johns Hopkins University used. So it fed you valid data, but oh, by the way, while you visited it, it's distributing malware to your systems. So my bottom line on this one is be very careful. Go back to that. Be careful of what websites you're visiting and what websites you're getting information from. The FBI, Department of Homeland Security, CISA organization, and Health and Human Services has also put out several joint reports specifically around ransomware, all sorts of activity there. You need to be careful. Ransomware is a big threat. So like I said, I'm not going to cover ransomware much, but let's talk about some of the specific scams. And I can play these later when we get to the Q&A session, but I actually have a voice recording of a bunch of these where you see the little speaker next to it. Lots of donation scams, and donation scams, unfortunately, sometimes directly hit because they siphon off, especially to nonprofits, they siphon off valid funding. If there's a natural disaster or coronavirus or anything else related to that, you really need to be careful around this time period. We all want to help, right? We all kind of rush to the need, but you need to make sure that your donation is going to the right place, because there are an awful lot of donation scams out there. During the beginning of the coronavirus, we saw a ton of personal protective equipment scams. I think you'll still see some of those, maybe not as bad. Lots of false remedy scams, right? Test kits, all sorts of that. There was a ton of stimulus check scams around that time period. I have no doubt that if Congress passes another stimulus check side of things, you're going to see another round of that. A lot of health insurance scam and a lot of small business scams going on too as well. All right.
Another couple questions for you, Don.
Sure.
Is it true that malware can be installed in our systems via a webcam if the webcam is plugged in but not being used?
It can in some instances. There are kind of limited instances. A lot of software or hardware that we buy and we plug into our systems comes with something called firmware. It's embedded software that's on that device that generally makes that device work. Bad guys have gotten crafty, and when you plug something in, usually these days USB, right? You plug it in so that you can use your webcam. It's communicating with your computer and potentially installing what's called a driver, right, onto your computer so that webcam will work. Well, sometimes these guys have gotten in there and put bad software along with the drivers. So you do need to buy your hardware from reputable places, and I'll talk through some good things that'll prevent some of that, keeping systems up to date, software and things like that. It can in limited cases. It's not super prevalent, but yeah, it's a possibility. Buy a reputable one, buy it from a known vendor, a known manufacturer, and then be very careful with the software that comes along with them. Oftentimes that malware comes usually with the add-on software that comes with it. They'll ship you disks or CDs or USB drives or things like that to plug in additional software. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you.
So the FTC is really warning folks that there's a lot of fraudulent scams out there. If you do see some of those, please do report them to the FTC. It has a site. And in fact, in the appendix, you'll get a copy of these slides. In the appendix, it gives you some reporting procedures for those types of things. Here's one I want to make everybody aware of, and I know we all kind of fall victim to it a little bit. We all use caller ID, right? It's that phone number that pops up either on your cell phone or your desk phone that says, so-and-so is calling me. Unfortunately, we've been kind of conditioned that we believe that is fact, right? When that display says Huntington Bank, when you pick up that phone and then the person says, hi, this is Susie from Huntington Bank, you're going to go, oh, well, I saw it on the display. She says she's from Huntington Bank. She must be from Huntington Bank. The reality is, though, that caller ID can be spoofed, and it's spoofed more and more these days. You'll see it on things that are very intrusive, like the call I just mentioned, someone calling you from Huntington Bank and potentially asking you for credentials. By the way, Huntington will never call you and ask you for your credentials. Or it can be semi-innocuous and just annoying, right? All of these spam phone calls we get, sales calls, soliciting calls, they'll oftentimes use a false caller ID so that you can't call them directly back. So don't answer calls from unknown numbers. Even be suspicious, though, when it does say who it is, right, at the top. So I wanted to bring that one up there. These days, unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people know that that caller ID can be spoofed too as well, all right? So imagine this one. If you received a text message, and imagine this is back in the March timeframe, right? We were all a little more panicky. And if you got a text message that says someone who came in contact with you tested positive or has shown symptoms for COVID-19 and recommends you self-isolate, get tested, more information here, you'd really want to click that link and figure that out, wouldn't you, right? You'd be very motivated. Remember that system one thinking, right? Your emotions take over more than your logic. You'd really want to click that link. Well, here was a scam that was going on, contact tracing and those types of things at that point in time were just kind of new. This was a scam. That clicking of that link would generally install malware or ask you for more information. There are a lot of these types of scams out there right now that are not coronavirus related. I just got a report from someone who doesn't even have a Huntington Bank account the other day that said, hey, I got this and I don't have a Huntington Bank account. And they sent me the text. I said, yeah, that's fraud. And I reported it to our folks and we try really hard to track it down as best we can and stop it, but it's just continues to crop up in places. So I wanted to make you aware, it's not just emails you get, it's not just phone calls you get, but it's text messages too as well these days. So that's kind of the coronavirus side of things. By all means, if you have questions, you can ask them now around coronavirus threats. I want to kind of transition really quickly here into business email compromise because I want to leave plenty of room for questions and answers. And business email compromise is really hitting nonprofits hard these days. In fact, we were talking before the webinar started. There's a nonprofit in Philadelphia I just saw effective last night, a Philadelphia food bank was unfortunately the victim of a business email compromise scam for the tune of $1 million. And it was a construction scam. And I think I have an example of construction scams in there. So what is business email compromise? Business email compromise is those fraudulent communications, usually an email, luring employees to take action that generally would result in the movement of funds, right? This is where bad guys just want to get the money out of you quick and move on, right? I do point out to folks the term compromise in there doesn't necessarily mean that the email accounts have been compromised. Sometimes they just send this fraudulent email from another email address. They make it look like somebody official, but it's not. I also like to contrast BEC from phishing, right? We've talked a lot about phishing emails. Phishing is generally trying to get you to click a link, all right, that gets malware or ransomware on your system, or compromising your credentials. They'll get your username and password. BEC goes directly to that. I want to get sensitive or personal information, but more often than not, I want to get funds directly out of you, right? So if you have people, you guys have suppliers or people you partner with, or even honestly, you got somebody who mows the lawn outside of the buildings, right? You're going to pay them. You're going to pay the lawn care maintenance folks. They're going to send you an electronic invoice. You're going to pay them type of thing. You need to be careful because that's the area in that invoice processing area where it really becomes vulnerable. And I'll give you some ways that you can really take care of that. The FBI is really given a good idea here. It's a huge problem, business email compromise. $12.5 billion globally between October of 2013 and May of 2018. That's, 2.9 billion of that's just in the U.S. And I do note at the bottom that, it's also on the rise associated with COVID-19. And there has been, the FBI is trying to take some of these things down. They did make some progress, but I'll tell you, as soon as one fraudster gets taken down, 3 or 4 more pop up. So let's break down BEC scams, right? vendor and invoicing. I told you about that one, right? That's a big, huge one up there. Some of it's impersonating external entities. A lot of it, though, is impersonating somebody. If you have, somebody in your organization who's your, person, your treasurer, your CFO type person, oftentimes it's impersonating a lead figure in an organization. What tactics are they using here? Really, they're using just like the phishing, right? Sense of urgency, right? They'll do timing of it very close to close of business, right? You're trying to get out of the office, wrap everything up, go into the weekend. Oftentimes, they'll even do it around a holiday weekend to give themselves an extra day. They'll use a crisis, a current crisis, whether it's pandemic or otherwise, to increase that urgency. The thing, and Amy gave a little bit of my background in working for the National Security Agency, a little in tune with the intelligence gathering side of things. The thing that scares me is what I'm seeing is these bad guys are getting really good at putting together a full dossier. They know exactly, they're gathering intelligence, they're looking at open source and social media. They're doing all that social engineering to fill in the puzzles, the pieces of the puzzle, to which they'll then do a scam, which is generally more successful because they've done a full workup on you as a target. So let's really quickly take a look at a few case studies. And here's one that specifically St. Ambrose in Northeast Ohio was really, their email server was compromised. So this is an example where there was compromise of an email system. The fraudsters sat there and monitored all their communications. Luckily, St. Ambrose was doing well, right? They were actually just getting ready to build a large new sanctuary for their parish. And they had a large contract with a construction firm. So the fraudsters actually sat there and watched a valid invoice from the construction firm to the parish go, right? And these are generally large sums of money, right? And then the fraudster, what they did is they spoofed a message to the construction firm and said, hey, oh, by the way, we need to change our wire instructions. We've changed our bank, and here's the routing number and here's the account number. We're now accepting payment here. And unfortunately, St. Ambrose fall victim to it to the tune of $1.75 million. I do, by the way, I think in the appendix give you the, if you fall victim, here are the things to do. I'll give you a few quick examples. I'm going to breeze through these quick. I'd rather you get to your questions. We only have a little bit of time left. School systems. Here's another one, Manor Independent School System, city of Ocala, Florida, very similar, very construction oriented. Ocala Airport construction, same kind of thing, $750,000 lost. City of Naples, another one, $700,000 lost. And this is probably, after all this, how you feel. And I apologize. But I tell you what, the second half here, we're going to go through things you can do to reduce it for your organization. So let's talk through some best practices, all right?
Right before we do, let's hit one more question. If I get an email from my boss to get gift cards, did my boss become a target because her email is out there in our website and our other communications?
Yeah, that's a perfect question, and the one that I'm going to talk about is actually what information you have on your website. I would be very judicious about what you put out there. Does your boss really need her email out there? If you are expecting constituents or folks to email them, then maybe it does. But I would tell you, don't put out people who do your electronic invoicing. Don't put that information out there. Only give it to the people who need to know it. Don't put anything about your processes. I know there's open transparency. Everybody says, well, as a nonprofit, I want to make sure people, know that we're, all their dollars go as much as possible to the need. But be very careful about what you put out there as far as processes and things like that. Your boss's email account may not have been targeted. It may just be spoofed. I will tell you what you need to do is really this first part is educate employees to know, hey, they're the first line of defense. They should ask you should have reporting procedures that say, see something, say something, right? And even though that email from your boss, right, from the scammer that says they're your boss, saying go out and buy gift cards, everybody should know they should challenge that, right? Even though the email said, I'm going to be unavailable, I need this done today, they should feel comfortable to challenge it. And your boss and everybody should know, yep, I want you to challenge it. Honestly, people in leadership should say, absolutely challenge me on those things. If you see an email that supposedly comes from me, challenge me on it, right? Make people aware, very similar to you guys. Thank you for joining the webinar. You educate yourself on what phishing and scams are out there so you can be much more educated, not fall victim to them. A couple things I'll gloss over really fast, and I'll just say, if you have somebody who handles your IT, go talk to them about it, right? Make sure you're using VPN, monitor for anomalies, use multi-factor. If you have banking accounts, use multi-factor authentication wherever it's authorized, right? There are protocols out there that are vulnerable. Make sure your IT folks do not use them. Remote desktop protocol is one of those. It should not be in your environment. Server message block, SMB, is also another one of those. It's got vulnerabilities. Bad guys will take advantage of them. So let's talk about the red flags you should see in BEC emails, right? Look for email address variations, user and domain name, right? It may have looked like it came from your boss, but it has a few strange characters in there, misspellings, right, in the email. That sense of urgency, remember, I'm in meetings all the day. I need you to do this today, kind of thing. Don't tell everyone. I want it to be a surprise. Only communicate back to me via email, this email. Change in email tone. We all communicate with each other, right? Especially folks in our organization. We all know generally what type of tone we have in our emails. If that changes, that should be a red flag. Removal of addresses, we've seen that too as well. You were communicating with a vendor, you're getting ready to pay them, and all of a sudden everybody but one address drops off the email chain. Why is that, right? Here are some procedural things you need to put in place. If anybody requests you to process, an invoice or something outside of normal procedures, that's a red flag. It immediately needs to be looked over, right? Any changes in payment structure. I'll use the St. Ambrose example. If they say, hey, we've changed banks, right? Here's the new routing and account information. You should say, okay, but we have a procedure, and our procedure is to do the following to validate that, right? Any changes in vendor, any changes to phone number, any beneficiary changes, don't just process those and assume those. There's a good payroll scam going on out there right now that says, hey, I need my direct deposit moved from this bank to that bank, right? Just an email that comes in because they found out enough information to impersonate one of your employees. Any name or account mismatch, or if a wire gets returned. I've seen a few frauds where the wire was tried 4 or 5 times because they kept getting things wrong, and unfortunately, the poor business that fell victim just continued to help the fraudster. Okay, we'll try it again. Okay, we'll try it again. When they should have said, "Whoa, wait a minute here. You weren't able to give me the actual matching account name that goes with it." Throw up red flags. Know your customers, know the people you deal with. If the phone never goes answered and goes directly to voicemail, make sure you get a human on the other end to validate these things. Any cultural changes or differences, sometimes changes in behavior you can note in the emails too as well. So here's some best practices. Obviously, we talked about educate. Here goes to your point earlier. Limit the publicly available information on your websites or social media, right? That only put out their contact information that's necessary. You really don't need organizational structure information out there. Just what's bare minimum that's necessary. Don't put out any process information. Here's how we process your payments, or here's how we process your donation. Don't put that out there. Have some well-documented processes about how you do this. Actually write them down, periodically review them and update them. Evaluate all of those from a fraud perspective. Say, how would I take advantage of this if I were a bad guy? Put multiple controls in place. The biggest one right here, callback procedures for verification. Remember when I talked about a payment change? Or if one of your employees who gets paid through your nonprofit actually says, hey, I need my direct deposit changed, have a process in place. They can't just send you an email and tell you that. There's a process, right? You have to get in contact with them with a phone number that you have on file. Same thing with a vendor, right? In your payment processing side of things, if you're going to write checks, if you're going to electronically disperse funds, have 2 people do that. One that submits it and the other one that approves it, right? It's not necessarily that you don't trust those people, although let's be real, you should have checks and balances on those 2 people. They have a lot of power around the funds for your nonprofit. But it's a protection for them, right? If one of those accounts gets compromised, right, the other one can catch it, right? If you can, independently assess all your processes, right? Someone from the outside come in and take a look at them. Report and save all suspected BEC. I talked about two-factor. We talked a little bit about brand, so I won't talk about that. And here's one I'm just going to say, go take it to your IT people who do it. If you are a large enough nonprofit to actually have a website, to have a domain, and your own email servers, talk to them about DMARC. Don't worry about knowing what that is. Just go back and say, hey, do we implement DMARC? And then show them this slide. I'd be negligent if I didn't say, you can do all the best practices possible and still have a problem. So cybersecurity liability insurance is an option, even for nonprofits, and it doesn't cost that much, and it will cover lots of things. I'm not going to go over all the things in this slide. Take a look at it afterwards. Talk with your organization and see if it's right. I'm going to skim through this next part to really get, since we only have a little bit of time left. I usually talk about the rest of best practices in this framework. It's called the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework. It breaks things down into 5 areas. I'm not going to cover them, but here are the points that I would have said. Some of these are very similar that I've already said. But you as a nonprofit are protecting not just money, right? But you're also protecting sensitive information. Some of that sensitive information relates to money. It's account numbers, personally identifiable information. All of us, right? We employ people, or we have people working for us that we have to have their information so that we can pay them. That sensitive information, you need to protect it. All right. By all means, there's some techie things in there too. Updating your operating systems and applications. Please talk to your IT departments about that. So hopefully I've opened your eyes a little bit to some of the scams that are going on these days. And hopefully, though, I've given you some tips and tricks to help you reduce the probability that you and your nonprofit are going to fall victim to any of these scams or anything that comes up, right? Because the bad guys are going to continue to invent new things, right? So with that, let's go for question and answer. Hopefully you guys got some good questions for me.
We've been asking them all along, but I'll give everybody a chance to think if you have anything else. You can unmute your. Don is here in the chat. What are some good password practices?
Excellent point. And in fact, usually I go through that in the best practices there. A couple. First of all, instead of using a password, use a passphrase, right? And this is a guy thing, I think. I'll be a little sexist here. The guy thing. We all remember lines from movies. You may remember lines from poetry, lines from a song, right? Anything like that. String together a sentence of words, not just one word. String together a relatively long password. It's much easier to remember if you remember that line from the movie. Put in the special characters, right? A number or two. It'll be a much stronger password. It'll be much easier to remember. Usually when I had presentations in person, I joke around with people, but not really joking. When I'd say put a few bad words in that password, because you'll never share it with other people then, because you don't want to admit that you know those bad words. So that works too as well. But I will also state, we all have way too many passwords to remember. I do recommend these days that people use a password manager. You don't have to use it for all your accounts, right? So for instance, I use a password manager. I don't put my bank password in there. I don't put my work password in there. Those I still remember myself. But the password manager handles all the rest of my passwords. My Wired magazine password, so I can read online the Wired articles. All the rest of those ones that it's really inconsequential, and they are relatively secure. The risk of you having your email password compromised are much larger these days than the password manager having a problem. There's a attack out there called credential stuffing. It's actually where they get your email, or they get your password that was compromised off a website, and they will try it on every other website possible, right? So they'll just continue your username and password on every website till it works, because they know that people reuse passwords, and you really shouldn't reuse passwords. If you're using a password manager, go ahead and allow it to pick a strong password for you. It's this random string of gibberish. It's such an easy interface. When you visit the website, it'll even fill in the password for you. It's easy. Other questions?
What password manager would you recommend?
Okay, I'm going to keep my lawyers happy on this one. Huntington does not recommend a specific password manager. I can tell you that I personally use LastPass. I can tell you that you can go out to some of the reputable computer kind of, top 5 password manager website kind of things and take a look at them. There are some good ones out there. Find one that operates across all platforms, right? I have an Apple iPhone, but I use Windows desktop, right? So you want one that works across those two. So yeah, there are some good ones out there, but the one I personally use is LastPass, and some of them are free. Don't even cost money. They'll try and sell you upgrades, but you can use the free version. It just gets it done as well. Any other questions? Mention the current event side of things. I mentioned the Philadelphia Food Bank one. That's within the last day or so. There have been several other large nonprofits. I had a couple of examples in a previous deck that I used. It was a little bit more dated. It was last year. It's just heartbreaking to see some of the good causes that have lost funding due to some of these scams. Take a look at them. You remember I told you if you do fall victim to a BEC scam, here's what you do. Contact the financial institution. They will try and stop the payment if at all possible. Report the crime to the FBI field office. And by the way, these are links in here that'll take you to find your FBI field office. Report it to the Internet Crime Complaint Center. If you do have cybersecurity liability insurance, contact your insurance carrier that will help you with forensics and remediation services, right? If you're interested, there's a slide in here called Personal Cybersecurity Basics. I give a whole presentation that talks about how you personally, with your cell phone and apps and geolocation and tracking, and we're all working from home, so your home network should be as secure, right? All of those types of things, credit card transactions. And then I give you a bunch of references, right? You'll find a bunch of articles out there on Huntington's website around privacy and security, FBI, Federal Trade Commission, all the rest of that kind of stuff. By the way, you personally should go out and freeze your credit reports that are out there. Here, I give you the links and how to go about doing that. If you have anybody who's interested in a career in cybersecurity, there's some links there too as well. I'd be happy to talk to them. And then I talk about fraud, and I think that's the last slide I have in the deck. All right.